what makes a society truly just? I mean, really just. And what about a person? What makes an individual genuinely good?
And are those two things connected? Fundamentally.
Exactly. These are huge questions, aren't they? They feel ancient, but wow, do they feel relevant right now?
Absolutely. Pretty much every political argument, every time you wrestle with a personal decision about right and wrong, you're sort of circling back to these very ideas. How we answer them, well, it shapes almost everything. Our laws, how we see ourselves.
And that is precisely what we're diving into today. We are taking on maybe one of the most influential, definitely challenging, and just absolutely essential texts in the history of Western thought, Plato's Republic.
It really is a journey, isn't it? A
Yes.
huge, sprawling dialogue that digs into justice in the state, justice in the soul, the nature of reality itself, education, the whole point of being human, really.
It's massive. So our mission here in this deep dive is to try and unpack those core concepts. We've got our sources ready, key bits from translations, introductions that help frame the whole thing, and analysis from scholars who've really spent their lives grappling with Plato.
Think of it like our roadmap, yeah. This stack of notes guiding us through this really quite profound landscape.
Our goal is to generate, hopefully, a clear, engaging overview. We want to pull out the key insights on, well, justice, the ideal society Plato dreams up, his theory of forms, the philosopher's role, how he saw the human soul, all of it.
Yeah, we're aiming for those aha moments,
Mm-hmm.
where these ancient, sometimes complex ideas suddenly just click and maybe shed some light on things for us today. So let's unpack this.
Okay, so the Republic kicks off, and it seems simple at first, right at the question, what is justice? But oh boy, you see almost right away in book one, getting a grip on that. It's anything but simple.
Right from the get-go, Socrates is talking to people with, well, different sort of everyday ideas about what justice means. You've got characters like Cephalus, the old wealthy man. His view is pretty traditional: pay your debts, tell the truth.
Which Socrates immediately starts, gently probing, like, should you always give back what you owe? What about giving weapons back to someone who's gone mad? That doesn't seem quite right, does it? Maybe not always the just thing in every single situation.
Exactly. And then his son, Polemarchus, jumps in and sort of refines that traditional view. He says justice is about helping your friends and harming your enemies. It's kind of fairness within your group, your tribe, and hostility towards outsiders.
Okay, helping friends, harming enemies, that sounds
Yeah.
familiar, maybe. So Socrates pushes on this, and he uses this analogy of justice being like a skill or an art.
Yeah.
Our sources point out this is where it starts to look like medicine or maybe piloting a ship.
Yeah, but if it's just a skill, Socrates asks, does it automatically have a good aim? That's the kicker.
Ah, right. Explain that bit more.
Well, think about it. A doctor has the skill to heal, but theoretically, the same skill could be used to make someone sick, couldn't it? Or someone skilled at guarding money is also, well, probably pretty skilled at stealing it if they wanted to.
Okay, I see. So if justice is just the skill of helping friends and harming enemies.
Couldn't a so-called just person, who's really good at this art, potentially use that skill for harm too? Maybe even harming their friends accidentally or helping their enemies.
And Socrates gets to this really provocative point, doesn't he? That under Polemarchus's definition, the just man could actually end up being a sort of thief, which understandably really upsets Polemarchus. He respects justice. He doesn't think of it like that at all.
Right. And the sources are careful to note, Socrates isn't necessarily trying to say just people are thieves. He's showing that Polemarchus's definition, by making justice just a skill applied to certain groups, friends, enemies, misses something crucial.
What's missing?
It's missing that built-in idea that a just action has to be aimed at some kind of good. It doesn't capture the moral core of justice, the feeling we have that it's fundamentally a good thing in itself.
Okay. And just as they're hashing this out, who storms into the conversation?
Thrasymachus,
Yeah.
the sophist. He's had enough of this polite back and forth. He comes in much more forcefully, much more cynically.
And he just lays it out there, doesn't he? Justice is nothing else than the interest of the stronger.
Ugh.
Boom.
That's the big challenge right there. Thrasymachus basically says, look, justice isn't some objective moral truth floating around. It's purely about power. In any state, democracy, tyranny, whatever the rulers, the stronger party, make laws that serve their interests.
And then?
And then they simply call obeying those self-serving laws justice. That's all it is. Convention, power dynamics.
So by that logic, injustice is just breaking the rules that powerful people set up.
Exactly. And he doesn't stop there. He makes an even bolder claim. Injustice pays. He flat out argues that the person who is powerful enough to commit injustice on a grand scale, think of a successful tyrant, and gets away with it, that person is actually happier, more successful, lives a better life than the conventionally just person.
Wow. So the just person is just naive, a sucker.
Pretty much, he sees the just man as simple-minded, easily taken advantage of. The really successful unjust person, the tyrant. Thrasymachus finds that person admirable, strong, clever, even if society labels them unjust. This forces the question right out into the open. Is justice a virtue, like an excellence that actually benefits you? Or is it a kind of weakness, a vice maybe, or just foolishness you're better off ditching?
Does Thrasymachus actually call justice a vice? The sources mention he kind of struggles with that label.
He does, yeah. He calls it noble good nature, which sounds positive, but the implication is clear. It's kind of simple-mindedness and innocence that makes you vulnerable. He's using conventionally good words, but twisting them to mean something foolish.
And the sources contrast him with another figure from Plato, right? Callicles.
Yes, Callicles is in the dialogue Gorgias. He's maybe a bit more philosophically consistent, or at least clearer. Callicles makes a sharp distinction between what he calls natural justice, which is basically makes the strong dominate the weak. That's just nature and conventional justice, which he sees as just a set of rules the weak majority invent to hold back the naturally superior strong individuals. He doesn't have Thrasymachus' awkwardness about calling conventional justice, well, basically foolishness.
Okay, so Thrasymachus throws down this massive challenge. Justice is for losers, injustice pays if you can pull it off. How does Socrates handle this initially in Book 1?
Well, he tries a couple of lines of argument. First, he points out that rulers aren't infallible. They can make mistakes, right? They might pass a law thinking it's in their interest, but actually it harms them. So if justice is simply obeying the ruler, then obeying these mistaken laws would be just, according to Thrasymachus' definition. But it wouldn't be in the interest of the stronger ruler. So the definition contradicts itself. This argument kind of hinges on the idea of a ruler in the precise sense, someone who doesn't make mistakes about their own interest.
Okay, what else?
He also goes back to that idea of ruling as an art or skill, like medicine. He argues that any true art aims at the good of its subject, not the practitioner. A good doctor aims to heal the patient, not just enrich themselves. A good pilot aims to get the ship safely to port for the sake of the crew and cargo. So a true ruler, practicing the art of ruling, should aim at the good of the people they rule, not just their own advantage.
But how convincing are these arguments, really? Do they shut Thrasymachus down?
Well, the sources are pretty clear that these initial arguments feel a bit weak. They don't really hit the core of Thrasymachus' claim, which is about whether an individual is better off being unjust, regardless of how you define the ideal ruler or art. Socrates manages to silence Thrasymachus, maybe confuses him a bit, but he doesn't really convince the others listening. That really unsettling idea that maybe injustice does pay is left hanging in the air, intellectually powerful.
Right. And that's the cue for Socrates' own friends, Glaucon and Adeimantus, to step up. They don't actually agree with Thrasymachus, do they?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
They want to believe justice is good, but they're deeply unsatisfied. They feel Socrates only refuted Thrasymachus superficially, maybe tripped him up logically, but didn't get to the heart of the matter. So they restate the challenge, but even more powerfully, more sharply.
What do they ask him to do?
They demand that Socrates prove that justice is good in and of itself,
Yeah.
intrinsically good. Good for the person who possesses it, deep down in their soul, completely separate from any external rewards or consequences. Forget about reputation, forget about divine rewards or punishments. They want to know, what does justice do to the soul of the just person that makes their life inherently better, happier, more worthwhile, even if nobody ever knows they're just, even if they suffer for it?
Wow. That's the ultimate challenge, isn't it?
Absolutely. This challenge basically sets the entire agenda for the rest of the massive work that is the Republic. It forces Socrates to build this incredibly elaborate, comprehensive argument to demonstrate the intrinsic value of justice.
And his strategy is fascinating. He doesn't just jump straight into analyzing the soul.
No, he says, look, justice is hard to see in something as small and complex as an individual soul. Let's look for it somewhere bigger, where the letters are larger, easier to read. Let's design an ideal city in theory, a city in speech. Find justice there first, and then see if we could apply that understanding back to the individual. He has to build this whole case, piece by piece, that the just life is, in its very nature, a happier life than the unjust life.
And that kicks off the construction of Callipolis, the beautiful city, the ideal state.
Right. He starts very simply, almost like Robinson Crusoe. Imagine a minimal community, a healthy city, based just on essential needs. Food, shelter, clothing. You need a farmer, a builder, a weaver, maybe a shoemaker. Basic division of labor based on natural aptitude. Everyone does one job.
Pretty basic, but that doesn't last long, does it?
No, because human desires aren't that simple. Glaucon complains the city is fit for pigs. People want more. So the city expands, becomes what Socrates calls a luxurious city, or maybe a feverish city. It gets filled up with non-essential desires and the occupations to satisfy them.
Like what?
Oh, the sources list things like hunters, artists, poets, musicians, cooks, barbers, tutors, people dealing with cosmetics, all sorts of things beyond basic survival. The city gets, as Socrates puts it, bloated and distended.
And this expansion, this drive for more than just the basics, it creates problems, right?
Big problems. You need more land, more resources. This leads to conflict with neighbors. And it also potentially leads to internal disorder. So you need a specialized class to deal with this. Soldiers, guardians, protectors.
The guardian class. And this luxurious city, it needs to be purged or purified somehow.
Yes, because to create these guardians, who need to be both fierce towards enemies and gentle towards citizens, you need a very specific upbringing and nature. You need to refine the city's culture and education to produce them. This leads Socrates to lay out the famous three-part structure of his ideal city.
Okay, what are the three classes?
At the bottom, you have the producers, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, handling the economic needs. Then you have the auxiliaries, the soldiers, who embody the city's spirit and courage, enforcing the ruler's decisions. And at the top, selected from the best of the auxiliaries through rigorous testing, are the guardians proper, who become the rulers. They represent the city's reason.
Producers, auxiliaries, rulers, and Plato argues this structure is what allows the city to be virtuous, to possess the key virtues.
Exactly. He identifies 4 cardinal virtues in the city. Wisdom, he says, is found primarily in that small ruling class, the guardians, because they have the knowledge of what's good for the city as a whole.
Okay, wisdom in the rulers. What about courage?
Courage resides in the auxiliaries, the soldier class. It's not just brute bravery, though. It's about preserving the right beliefs, instilled by the ruler's education, about what truly is and isn't to be feared, even in the face of danger or temptation.
Right. Wisdom, courage, temperance. That one seems a bit different.
It is. Temperance, or moderation, isn't located in just one class. Plato describes it more like a kind of harmony or attunement that stretches across the entire city. It's a fundamental agreement, a unanimity, among all 3 classes, rulers, soldiers, and producers, about who should rule. It's the acceptance by the lower parts that the higher part, reason embodied in the guardians, ought to be in charge. It's a property of the whole city.
Interesting. So it's like an internal consensus. Wisdom, courage, temperance. And that leaves justice. What is justice in the city?
Justice, in Plato's famous definition here, is simply each class doing the specific job for which its nature has best equipped it, and not meddling in the jobs of the other classes. The producers produce, the auxiliaries defend, the guardians rule. Mind your own business, essentially. This principle of specialization and non-interference, this right ordering, is justice in the state for Plato.
Okay, doing one's own job. Now, the sources point out that definition can feel, well, a bit strange to us, can't it?
It definitely can. It seems to cut justice off from some of our usual ideas, like equality or giving people what they're due, or maybe the idea of not taking more than your share, what the Greeks called pleonexia.
So how does Plato connect his definition back to those more common ideas? Does he try?
He does. He argues, for example, that judges in his ideal city, when settling disputes, would aim to ensure that no one has what belongs to another, or is deprived of what is their own. He suggests that in his perfectly ordered city, people do possess what is rightfully their own, their specific role, their function, their place in the whole, precisely because everyone is doing the job suited to their nature. That's how things are properly distributed.
So it's like finding the deep structure under the surface symptoms.
That's a great way to put it. And one source uses a similar analogy, like a scientist. You start with the symptoms, everyday instances of justice or injustice, and you try to find the underlying structure or cause. Plato thinks he's found it in this doing one's own principle. And once you find that deeper structure, it might refine your understanding of the concept itself. You might realize justice can exist in this perfectly ordered system, even if it doesn't always look like punishing theft in our messy world. You're still identifying the same core thing, just at a more fundamental level.
Now, speaking of this ideal city, especially the guardians who rule it, Plato introduces some really radical proposals for how they should live, things that still shock people
Oh,
today.
absolutely. He advocates for completely communal living for the guardians and auxiliaries. They eat together, train together, live in barracks. No private houses.
And no private property at all for them.
None whatsoever. They're supported by the producers, but own nothing personally. And maybe even more radically, he calls for the abolition of the traditional nuclear family among the guardians. Communal partners, essentially. Mating festivals arranged by the state, supposedly based on eugenic principles to produce the best offspring. And the children. They're taken away immediately after birth and raised in communal nurseries, without knowing their biological parents, and parents not knowing their specific children. Everyone in that generation is considered brother and sister. Everyone in the older generation, mother or father.
Wow. Okay, why? What's the justification for such extreme measures? They seem almost anti-human in a way.
Plato's justification, as the sources explain it, boils down to one primary goal: maximizing the unity of the state. He believed unity was the greatest good for a city, and private property and private families were the biggest sources of disunity, conflict, and self-interest. If the guardians have nothing private, if they regard all fellow guardians as family, they will care only for the good of the whole city. Their happiness isn't meant to come from personal wealth or family ties, but from the flourishing of the community they serve.
But did everyone buy this? I mean, even in ancient Greece.
Definitely not. The sources make sure to bring up Aristotle, Plato's own student, who famously criticized these very proposals. Aristotle thought communal ownership was probably unworkable.
People would still try to figure out who their kids were based on resemblance, for instance. More fundamentally, he argued it would destroy natural affection and care.
How so?
He believed that people naturally care more for what is their own family, their own property. What's common to the greatest number gets the least amount of care, he argued. Communal arrangements would dilute affection and responsibility, not strengthen unity in a meaningful way.
Okay, that's a powerful critique. This perfectly unified communistic guardian class leads us right to Plato's most famous, maybe most infamous, political claim.
Ah, yes. That states will never have rest from troubles, will never be governed well, unless philosophers become kings, or the current kings and rulers genuinely take up philosophy.
The philosopher king. Why does he think only philosophers are fit to rule? It's not just about being smart or well-meaning for Plato. He argues that philosophers possess certain natural talents, yes, but crucially, they have access to true knowledge. Not just opinion or belief, but actual knowledge of reality. And this knowledge, he believes, makes them capable of a higher, more perfect form of morality, and gives them the understanding needed to govern justly for the good of the whole state.
And this knowledge is distinct from what most people have.
Entirely. He contrasts philosophers with, well, the general run of mankind, who live in the world of appearances, the world of the senses, and don't even acknowledge the existence of the forms, which are the objects of true knowledge.
Okay, let's talk about these forms. The theory of forms is absolutely central to Plato's whole system here, isn't it?
It's fundamental. You really can't understand the Republic without grappling with it. So the forms, think of the form of justice, the form of beauty, the form of equality, and ultimately the form of the good. These are, for Plato, eternal, unchanging, perfect, non-physical blueprints or standards. They exist in a realm beyond our senses, an intelligible realm. They are the true reality, and because they are stable and perfect, they are the only things we can have genuine knowledge of.
And how does this compare to the world we see and touch?
That world, the world of physical objects we perceive through our senses, is, for Plato, a world of fleeting, imperfect copies or participants in the forms. Things in this world are and are not, as he puts it.
What does that mean, are and are not?
Well, a beautiful painting might fade or be compared to something more beautiful. A large dog is small compared to an elephant. Things in the sensory world are temporary, they change, they can possess opposite qualities depending on the context or time. They lack the permanence and perfection of the forms.
So you can't have true knowledge of this sensory world.
Not knowledge in Plato's strict sense. Because it's unstable and contradictory, the sensory world is the realm of belief or opinion, doxa. Beliefs can be right or wrong, useful or not, but they're always less certain, less clear than knowledge, which must be about what is eternally and unchangingly real, the forms. Belief is sort of halfway between complete ignorance and true knowledge.
How does Plato argue for the existence of these forms? Does he just assert it?
He often presents them as something we almost implicitly recognize. How, the sources suggest, he might ask, could we identify many different things as beautiful? unless they all shared something in common, unless they all participated in some way in the single form of beauty itself. How could we judge things as equal if we didn't have some concept of perfect equality as a standard? The forms are the necessary standards that make identification, comparison, and judgment possible in the first place.
Okay, and within this realm of forms, there's a hierarchy. One form is supreme.
Yes, absolutely. At the very pinnacle is the form of the good.
The form of the good. Socrates calls this the greatest study, right? What makes it so important for the philosopher rulers?
He explains that the form of the good is the ultimate source of reality and intelligibility for all the other forms, and it's also the source from which all just actions and other good things derive their value and usefulness. It's the ultimate why behind everything, the source of order, value, and being itself. Understanding the good is what allows the philosopher to know what is truly beneficial for the state and the soul.
But can he actually define it? Tell us what the good is.
Famously, no. Socrates says he can't give a direct account of the good itself, perhaps because it's beyond ordinary definition, but he can explain what it's like through analogies. And this leads us to those three incredibly famous images: the sun, the divided line, and the allegory of the cave.
These are crucial for understanding the philosopher's journey and knowledge, aren't they? Let's unpack them. Start with the sun.
Okay, the sun analogy. In the visible world, the sun does two things, right? It provides the light that enables our eyes to see physical objects, and it also provides the power for those objects to grow, to exist, to be.
Right. Light and existence.
So, analogously, in the intelligible realm, the world of forms, the form of the good does two similar things. It provides the intellectual light, truth, intelligibility, that enables our minds, our intellect, to see or understand the other forms. And even more profoundly, it is the ultimate source of the very being or reality of the forms themselves, just as the sun is the source of existence for things in the visible world.
Wow, okay. So the good is like the sun for the mind and for reality itself. What about the divided line? That sounds more technical.
It is a bit. Imagine a line divided into two main sections, representing the visible realm and the intelligible realm. Plato says to divide it unequally. Then divide each of those sections again in the same ratio, so you end up with 4 segments.
4 segments, what do they represent?
They represent ascending levels of reality and the corresponding states of mind. The lowest segment of the visible realm is images, shadows, reflections, pictures. The state of mind associated with this is aikasia, often translated as imagination or conjecture. Just seeing flickering images without understanding. Okay, lowest level. What's next up in the visible realm? Actual physical objects, the animals, plants, and manufactured things around us. The state of mind here is pistis, which means belief or trust. You recognize objects, but you don't have true knowledge of their underlying reality, the forms.
So that's the whole visible world, split into images and objects corresponding to imagination and belief. Now we cross the main divide into the intelligible realm.
Exactly. The lower section of the intelligible realm involves mathematical objects or concepts, and the kind of thinking associated with them is dianoia, often translated as thinking or understanding. Mathematicians use visible diagrams, like images, as aids, but they're thinking about abstract, non-physical things like the square itself, not the particular square they drew. They reason from hypotheses or assumptions.
And the highest section of the entire line.
That represents the forms themselves, grasped directly by the intellect without relying on sensory images or unexamined hypotheses. This highest state of cognition is noesis, pure understanding, intellection, philosophical insight. This is where true knowledge resides, culminating in the understanding of the form of the good, which illuminates all other forms.
And the sources mention mathematics is key for moving between realms.
Yes, mathematics is crucial because it deals with abstract, unchanging objects. It forces the mind to turn away from the physical world of belief towards the intelligible world of thought. It's presented as a key part of the educational curriculum that helps draw the soul out of the cave.
Speaking of which, the allegory of the cave. Probably the most famous part of the Republic. Plato says it sums up everything that came before, right?
He does. He says, this image must be applied as a whole to what has gone before. It's a powerful synthesis. So picture prisoners chained in a dark underground cave since birth. They're facing a flat wall.
Chained how?
So they can only look straight ahead, at the wall. Behind them, there's a fire burning. And between the fire and the prisoners, there's a low wall, like a puppet theater screen. Along this wall, people walk carrying statues and models of various things, animals, people, objects.
And the fire casts shadows of these puppets onto the wall the prisoners are facing.
Precisely. For the prisoners, who have known nothing else their entire lives, these shadows are reality. That's the lowest level of the divided line, icasia, mistaking flickering images for the real thing.
Okay, then what happens?
Imagine one prisoner is freed. He's forced to turn around and look towards the fire. His eyes hurt, he's confused. He sees the puppets, the actual objects casting the shadows. This is a step up, like moving from icasia to pistis, belief.
Yeah.
Seeing the actual objects, though still only artificial ones within the cave. It's painful and disorienting.
Still in the cave, though. Still in the realm of the visible, or at least its equivalent.
Right. Then he's dragged forcibly up a steep, rough path out of the cave altogether and into the sunlight outside. This ascent represents the difficult journey of education, the turning of the soul from the world of appearances, the visible realm, to the world of true reality, the intelligible realm.
And outside the cave, what does he see?
At first, the sunlight is blinding. You can only look at shadows. Then reflections in water. This might correspond to the mathematical thinking stage. Dianoia dealing with images of reality. Then gradually his eyes adjust, and he can see the actual objects outside. The trees, the animals, the stars, the moon. These represent the forms.
And finally?
Finally, he is able to look directly at the sun itself. The sun represents the form of the good, the ultimate source of truth and reality. Seeing the sun is the highest stage of knowledge, noesis, the philosopher's ultimate goal. The entire journey is the painful, difficult process of philosophical enlightenment, moving from ignorance and illusion to truth and understanding.
It's an incredibly powerful image of education and the pursuit of truth, but you mentioned earlier the source of stress. It doesn't end there.
Crucially, no. The allegory has another vital part. The philosopher who has escaped the cave and seen the sun, seen the good, understands reality. But he feels pity for the prisoners still trapped below. He has a duty, a responsibility to go back down.
Back into the cave. Why?
To rule. To guide the others, to try and free them from their illusions. Even though they won't understand him, they'll think he's crazy, his eyes will struggle to readjust to the dim light, and they might even try to kill him for disturbing their comfortable ignorance. He has to descend back into the world of politics and human affairs.
And this brings us back to that really tough question you raised earlier. Why on earth would the philosopher want to go back down? If their greatest happiness is contemplating the forms, contemplating the good, why give that up to go back into the messy, confusing, dangerous cave of politics? Why be actually just if justice demands this kind of sacrifice of personal fulfillment?
This is a central tension. And Plato's answer, according to the sources, is profound. The philosopher, having grasped the form of the good, doesn't just see particular things. They see the whole system, the whole order. They understand reality from an impersonal standpoint.
Impersonal. How does that help?
They see their own happiness, their own fulfillment through contemplation, not just as their private good, but as one part of the overall cosmic order governed by the good. They understand their role within that structure. From this enlightened viewpoint, sacrificing their personal preference, staying outside the cave, to fulfill their duty, ruling the city for the good of the whole, isn't experienced as a bitter sacrifice that breeds resentment.
So it's not like they're gritting their teeth and doing something they hate.
The idea is that their perspective has shifted. They judge from a standpoint where the impersonal requirements of the good, the needs of the whole system they now understand, take precedence over their individual desires or interests. Their commitment is to the objective good, which includes the well-being of the city they are uniquely qualified to govern. It's a demand of their own enlightened reason.
Okay, so Plato's built the ideal city, identified the philosopher-ruler grounded in knowledge of the forms and the good. Now, finally, he has to bring this whole structure back to the individual soul to answer Glaucon and Diamontis' challenge directly. How does he make that connection?
He uses the structure of the city as a direct analog for the structure of the soul. And the key to arguing for the soul's structure is what the sources call the principle of conflict.
The principle of conflict. Remind us what that is again.
It's the basic logical point that the same thing cannot simultaneously do or undergo opposite things in the same respect and in relation to the same thing.
Okay, sounds a bit abstract. Give us the example.
Plato's classic example is thirst. Imagine you're really thirsty. There's a part of you, the thirsty part, that just wants to drink right now. Simple urge. But maybe you know the only water available is contaminated, poisonous. So at the exact same moment you feel the urge to drink, you also feel a resistance, a command not to drink.
Wanting to drink and wanting not to drink at the same time.
Exactly. These are opposite impulses happening simultaneously within you. According to the principle of conflict, this proves that you are not a single unified thing. You must contain different parts, one part urging you to drink, another part resisting. This internal conflict reveals the complexity of the soul.
And this principle allows him to identify how many parts in the soul.
3 distinct parts, mirroring the 3 classes in the ideal city.
Okay, lay them out for us. Part 1.
First, there's reason, logistikon. This is the rational calculating part. It's the part that thinks, learns, loves truth, and seeks understanding. And importantly, the sources emphasize, for Plato, reason isn't just a tool to figure out how to get what the other parts want. It's not, as David Hume later famously put it, just a slave of the passions. Reason has its own goals, primarily truth and understanding, and its own motivational force. It can judge what's best for the whole person and can actively suppress desires if needed.
Okay, reason at the top. What's the second part?
Second is spirit, or thymos, thymoides. This is the energetic, assertive part associated with emotions like anger, indignation, ambition, honor, self-esteem. It's the part that gets fired up about injustice, or feels pride or shame. Plato sees spirit as the natural ally of reason when it's properly educated. It provides the oomph, the emotional drive to carry out reason's judgments, especially against the pull of desires.
Like the auxiliaries backing up the rulers. Okay, reason, spirit, and the third part.
Third is appetite, epithemedikon. This is generally seen as the largest, most diverse, and potentially most unruly part of the soul. It encompasses all the basic bodily desires, hunger, thirst, sex, and also the desires for the means to satisfy them, especially the love of money and material possessions. As we saw with thirst, this part just wants gratification, often without regard for the whole person's well-being.
So, reason, spirit, appetite.
Yeah.
A tripartite soul mirroring the rulers, auxiliaries, producers in the city. Now, the crucial step. What does justice look like inside the individual soul?
Just like in the city, justice in the soul is achieved when each of these 3 parts does its own proper work and stays within its own bounds. It's about internal order and harmony. Meaning, reason rules, guided by wisdom and looking out for the good of the entire soul. Spirit acts as reason's ally, enforcing its decisions with courage and conviction. And appetite is kept in check, controlled and guided by reason and spirit so its desires are managed and don't take over the whole personality. The appetites aren't eliminated, you still need to eat, but they aren't in the driver's seat.
So, justice in the soul is this state of internal harmony, proper hierarchy, right ordering. The sources compare it to physical health.
Exactly. Justice is the psychic equivalent of health. It's the soul functioning optimally, a stably functioning state where all parts work together correctly under the leadership of reason.
And injustice, then, must be the opposite.
Precisely. Injustice is internal rebellion. It's psychic disorder, disease. It happens when one of the lower parts, spirit, or more typically the many-headed beast of appetite, usurps control and tries to rule over reason, even though it's not fit to do so. This leads to inner conflict, turmoil, instability, and upset and unstable state.
And this is where Plato lands his answer to Glaucon and Adeimantus. This is how he proves justice is good in itself.
This is the core of it. The sources make this connection crystal clear. If justice is the health, harmony, and proper functioning of the soul, and injustice is its disease, disorder, and dysfunction, well, the choice becomes obvious, doesn't it?
Nobody in their right mind would choose to have a diseased, dysfunctional body if they could be healthy.
Exactly. And Plato argues, by analogy, that no one in their right mind would choose to have a diseased, disordered, fundamentally conflicted soul. Therefore, justice, being the soul's health, is inherently good and desirable for its own sake. It is the state that constitutes psychic well-being and makes happiness, eudaimonia, possible. Injustice, doing the soul's disease, inherently leads to misery, regardless of any external appearances of success.
So the just person is happy because their soul is ordered correctly, not because of reputation or rewards.
That's the heart of Plato's argument. The internal state of justice is the foundation of true human flourishing. The tyrant, who appears all-powerful but whose soul is ruled by chaotic appetite, is ultimately presented as the most wretched and unhappy of all human beings.
Okay, so if justice is this internal state of health, how do you achieve it? Particularly for the guardians who need to be perfectly just to rule. This brings us to education.
Yes, the education system designed for the guardians is absolutely crucial. And again, it's not about cramming facts or getting credentials in our modern sense. Its primary aim is character formation, soul shaping. It's about cultivating the different parts of the soul and ensuring they develop in the right balance so that reason can ultimately take charge, supported by spirit.
It starts very young, doesn't it, with music and gymnastics?
It does. Gymnastics is for the body, obviously. But music for Plato is much broader than just melodies. It includes poetry, stories, literature, harmony, rhythm, essentially, the whole cultural and artistic education. The sources mention careful selection of harmonies and rhythms, avoiding modes that express sorrow or softness, favoring those that encourage courage and temperance.
Why start with music before they can even properly reason?
Because Plato believed that rhythm and harmony sink deep into the soul, even in childhood. Exposure to the right kinds of music shapes the child's emotions and aesthetic sensibilities, developing a love for order, grace, and harmony. This prepares the soul, makes it receptive, so that when reason does develop later, the person will recognize it and welcome it as a kindred thing, because their character has already been attuned to its principles.
Fascinating. So it's like pre-rational character training. What comes after music and gymnastics?
Then comes the study of mathematics, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, harmonics. As we discussed with the divided line, mathematics is vital for turning the mind away from the changing concrete world of the senses towards the abstract, unchanging, intelligible realm. It forces abstract thought, prepares the mind for higher philosophical understanding. The sources call it one of the few subjects in a curriculum that can really start drawing the soul out of the cave.
And the peak of this education.
The peak is dialectic. This is the ultimate philosophical training, undertaken only by the most promising students after their mathematical studies, usually when they're older. It's the method of rigorous philosophical argument, questioning assumptions, reasoning back to first principles, and ultimately, hopefully, achieving direct intellectual insight into the forms and the form of the good itself. It's about achieving genuine understanding, not just winning arguments.
Now, alongside this rigorous curriculum, there's a very controversial element: censorship.
Yes, Plato is quite explicit about the need for strict censorship, especially in the early stages of education.
Why does he think it's so necessary?
Because the stories in our children are exposed to shape their souls profoundly. To cultivate the right virtues in the guardians, courage, piety, respect for law, temperance, you cannot expose them to traditional myths and poems like Homer's that depict gods behaving badly, lying, cheating, fighting, or heroes wailing, fearing death, or being overcome by laughter or grief. These stories instill the wrong values, model the wrong behaviors, and appeal to the lower emotional parts of the soul. He's particularly critical of poets, isn't he? The sources really highlight this.
Very critical. He argues, as we touched on before, that poets are mere imitators. They operate at 2 removes from reality, or even 3 if you start from the forms.
How does that work? 3 removes.
The form, like the form of a bed, is the true reality. The craftsman makes a particular physical bed, which is 1 remove, an imitation of the form. The painter or poet then depicts that physical bed, which is a further remove, an imitation of an imitation. They're creating appearances, not reality.
And the sources add another layer to this critique, right? About knowledge.
Yes. Plato argues poets lack true knowledge of the things they imitate. The poet writing about warfare isn't a general. The one writing about charioteering isn't a charioteer. They haven't got the knowledge of the maker, let alone the user, who understands the purpose best. They just create images of activities they don't truly understand. So their work can't offer real wisdom, and worse, by focusing on emotions and appearances, it can actually corrupt the soul, strengthening the lower parts against reason.
Okay, so after designing this ideal, reason-ruled state and soul, Plato then does something interesting. He shows how it all falls apart. He describes the degeneration of states.
Right, it's a famous cycle of decline. The ideal state, the aristocracy, ruled by the best, the rational philosophers, is inherently unstable because human nature is flawed. It inevitably decays.
What's the first step down?
It declines first into timocracy, a state ruled by the ambitious, honor-loving warrior class. Spirit takes over from reason. Then, from timocracy, it decays further into oligarchy.
Oligarchy, that's rule by.
Rule by the wealthy. Here, the dominant element is the appetite for money. The sources give us a bit more detail on this stage. The oligarchic state values wealth above all else. Political power depends on property qualifications.
An oligarchic man, what's he like?
He's dominated by the necessary appetites, particularly the desire for money. Reason and spirit are demoted. They become slaves forced to serve the goal of accumulating wealth. Plato suggests this type often arises when the son of a timocratic, honor-loving man sees his father ruined, perhaps losing his honor and position, and turns cynically towards the more solid pursuit of riches.
How does Plato critique this oligarchic life? It might seem orderly, focused.
He sees it as deeply flawed. The oligarch rigorously suppresses any desires that might cost money or interfere with profit-making. He lives frugally, works hard, but focuses squalidly, as Plato puts it, only on gain. While he might appear controlled, his soul lacks true unity and harmony because it's ruled by just one part with it, the appetite for money, regardless of the overall good of the soul. It's described as a repressed and deformed personality.
The sources mention Plato has this idea of the oligarch being not one man but two.
Yeah, sort of divided between the necessary desires he indulges for business and the unnecessary desires for luxury, etc., that he fiercely suppresses because they cost money. The sources suggest this specific two-men idea might be a bit schematic and less compelling than the broader point about the psychological damage caused by the obsessive pursuit of wealth over all other values. Okay, so from oligarchy, where does the decline go next?
Downhill to democracy. In Plato's view, the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few in the oligarchy eventually leads to resentment and revolution, establishing a democracy where freedom is the highest value.
And Plato isn't a fan of democracy, is he? Even though Athens was one?
Not in this form. He sees this kind of democracy as characterized by excessive freedom, bordering on anarchy. There's no governing principle. Everyone is treated as equal whether they are or not, and people are free to pursue any desire that pops into their head. The democratic man reflects this. He gives free rein to all desires equally, necessary and unnecessary, noble and base, shifting from one pursuit to another without any stable principle or order in his soul.
Why is this so bad in his view? The sources mention it's seen as a step towards the worst regime.
Because this absolute freedom and lack of order, this catering to every whim, leads to chaos and instability. The constant pursuit of pleasure and the rejection of authority eventually create such disorder that the people themselves will long for a strong man to restore order. And that leads directly to the final, lowest form of government.
Tyranny. The rule by a single individual, the tyrant, who is himself ruled by the most base, lawless appetites. The tyrannical soul is a complete inversion of the just soul. Reason and spirit are totally enslaved by monstrous, unnecessary desires.
And this whole cycle of degeneration serves to reinforce his argument about justice, showing how deviating from the rule of reason leads progressively to worse states and worse kinds of human souls, culminating in the utter misery of the tyrant.
Now, after all this complex political and psychological analysis, the Republic ends on a different note, doesn't it? With a myth.
Yes, the myth of It's quite a dramatic conclusion.
What's its purpose?
Huh.
Based strictly on the sources we have, what role does it play?
Our sources indicate that the myth serves as a kind of capstone to the Republic's main arguments about justice and morality. It provides a narrative framework suggesting that the choices we make in this life, the kind of character we develop, just or unjust, have profound consequences, not only for our happiness here and now, which was the main focus of the argument, but potentially also in an afterlife and in future reincarnations. It reinforces the idea that living justly is cosmically significant. The sources don't go into the specific story of but focus on its function in bolstering the case for justice. Okay, so we've journeyed through this incredible text. Looking back, what are the big, enduring contributions of the Republic? And what are the main criticisms people raise?
Well, the contributions are just immense, aren't they? It's arguably the starting point for Western political philosophy, the whole idea of designing an ideal state, analyzing existing forms of government, the relationship between ethics and politics.
And its influence on epistemology, the theory of knowledge and metaphysics. The theory of reality is profound. The theory of forms, the distinction between knowledge and belief, the allegory of the cave. These ideas have echoed down through centuries of philosophy.
Absolutely. And in ethics, too. The central quest for the definition and value of justice, the brilliant analogy between the city and the soul, the definition of justice as internal harmony or psychic health, and crucially, that argument linking virtue directly to happiness, these are concepts we still wrestle with today. That idea of the just soul being the healthy, flourishing soul is incredibly powerful.
But it's also, let's be honest, a deeply controversial text. The criticisms are significant, as the sources clearly acknowledge.
Top of the list usually are the authoritarian aspects, right? From a modern liberal perspective, it's quite stark.
Definitely. The pervasive censorship, the rigid hierarchical class system with little room for individual mobility, the abolition of private life and family for the ruling class, the general lack of individual freedom and rights as we understand them, these elements clash strongly with modern democratic ideals.
There's also the charge of elitism, which seems hard to deny.
Yes, the whole system rests on the idea that only a tiny minority, the philosophers, are capable of true knowledge and therefore true justice and are fit to rule. Everyone else is relegated to subordinate roles. The sources point out that this elitism is pretty much baked in, even without the whole philosopher-king apparatus, just by the way he sets up the classes, but the requirement of philosophical knowledge really cements it.
And then there's a question of practicality. Is this ideal state, Kallipolis, even remotely achievable, or even desirable for actual human beings?
That's a perennial critique. Aristotle's points about communal living feeling unnatural are just one example. Many critics argue that Plato's proposals ignore or try to suppress fundamental aspects of human nature, making the whole project utopian in the negative sense, unrealistic, and potentially oppressive if ever attempted.
People also take issue with Plato's definition of justice itself, don't they? That doing one's own idea.
Right. Does it really capture all that we mean by justice? Critics argue it leaves out crucial elements like fairness, equality, individual rights, compassion, or the simple duty not to harm others. It seems very focused on internal order and function, perhaps at the expense of interpersonal ethics.
And structurally, how does the argument hold up for modern readers? The sources mentioned a potential split.
Yeah, some commentators feel the grand analogy between the city and the soul, while ingenious maybe splits down the middle for us today. The argument for individual justice being psychic health, ruled by reason, can feel very compelling on its own, almost detachable from the elaborate and often problematic political structure of Callipolis that Plato built primarily to discover that definition of justice. There's also that underlying tension we discussed between the philosopher's duty to rule, the practical life, and their desire for contemplation, the theoretical life.
And finally, circling back to the very beginning, the sources acknowledge that those initial arguments Socrates uses against Thrasymachus in Book 1, the ones trying to refute the injustice pays thesis head-on, well, they just don't fully convince everyone, do they? That raw challenge perhaps lingers.
It's true. For some readers, the brute force of Thrasymachus' cynicism isn't completely neutralized by those early logical maneuvers. The main argument for justice comes later, with the soul as health analogy.
Yet, despite all these criticisms, all these challenges across millennia, the Republic remains, well, incredibly relevant, doesn't it?
It really does. It just keeps forcing us to think about the most fundamental questions.
Mhm.
What is justice? What's the best way to organize a society? What's the relationship between the individual and the state? What kind of education produces good citizens and leaders? What is the role of knowledge in politics?
And it relentlessly pushes us on that ultimate ethical question. What does it mean to live a truly good, flourishing human life? What is happiness, really? And is it, as Plato passionately argues, impossible without being a just person, without having that rightly ordered soul?
Plato's stance here is so distinct from many other views. He's not saying justice is good because it leads to happiness as some separate consequence, or that it maximizes happiness for the most people, utilitarianism. He's arguing that the state of being just, that internal harmony ruled by reason, is the state of human flourishing.
It's like you only get happiness if you're just, and you only get it by really being just. The sources suggest the happiness of the just person might not even appeal to someone who doesn't already value being just. It's not a simple means to an end calculation.
Right. He's trying to persuade us to fundamentally change how we conceive of both justice and happiness, to see them as intrinsically linked, maybe even two aspects of the same thing, the well-functioning human soul. Justice is the soul's health, and health is well-being.
So we've taken quite a journey through Plato's Republic. We started with that seemingly simple question, what is justice? And followed Socrates as he built an entire ideal city in speech, introduced the philosopher king and the mind-bending theory of forms, analyzed the structure of the human soul, laid out a radical educational program, traced the decline into tyranny, and ultimately argued for justice as the soul's own reward.
It's an astonishingly ambitious work. And despite its ancient context, despite the parts that seem alien or even repellent to us now, it continues to be this incredibly powerful text. Why? Because it tackles head-on with such intellectual force and imaginative brilliance these timeless questions about how we ought to live, both as individuals and together in society. It makes us scrutinize our own assumptions about justice, power, knowledge, and what a truly good life entails.
And it leaves you perhaps with this final, really provocative thought that emerges from the sources. Plato argues forcefully that true justice is the internal health and harmony of the soul, ruled by reason, and that this is the only reliable path to genuine, stable happiness. He compares it directly to physical health, who would choose sickness.
But think about it. Is living justly, especially in a world that often rewards injustice or seems indifferent to virtue, truly as self-evidently desirable, as clearly beneficial to the individual as physical health is? Is that analogy perfect? Is Plato asking us to see our own well-being in a radically different, perhaps counterintuitive way?
What stands out to you after this deep dive into Plato's Republic?